Hello, everyone. My name is Brielle Nikoloff, and I am Botmock's product manager. Thank you for joining us today. We're super excited about this session. We have a panel of amazing designers, as everybody already knows, I'm sure. If you want to type into the chat your name, where you're from, that would be great, just to start off. And we received amazing questions this session, so we're going to be answering things like, how does one transition from being a student to paid jobs in conversation design, and are there opportunities for freelancing? Another question will be, why is this industry evolving? How is it not a one and done field? If one company makes a chatbot, can't everyone else just copy it with some tweaks? That's such a good question. Yeah, so I'll quickly introduce our panelists. And let's go back to the first slide. All right, so first, Celine. Celine is a senior user experience designer with a focus on conversational design for a large home improvement retailer. She graduated from the University of Georgia with a dual degree in international affairs and economics. Shortly after, while studying for her LSATs and applying for law schools, she served as an executive director for a nonprofit dedicated to empowering Asian Americans through arts and entertainment. This is where she found her love for creativity and entrepreneurship. She says, UX is a profession that allowed me to mold my love for creativity, problem solving, and business strategy. And this newfound love for UX led her to not submit a seat deposit to law school, but instead apply for a boot camp course at General Assembly. It was her first UX job, and she found a way to, again, mold her love for research, writing, and design by working on conversational design projects across the company. All right, next we have Rebecca. Rebecca Evanhoe has worked as a conversation designer for 8 years at Shadow Health, Mobiquity, and most recently, Amazon Web Services. She's worked on voice interactions and chatbots for healthcare training, fast food, banking, and insurance, hospitality, and even trucking. Thanks, Rebecca, for being here. All right, next up is Mary. Mary has been a voice interaction designer for 20 years. Most recently, she was contracting at Facebook, working with speech, sound design, assistant, and other teams on a number of initiatives, including Facebook Portal. At Honeywell, Mary was the global lead for voice design, collaborating on a range of products for consumers and workers. At Nuance, Mary was a design lead on natural language and directed dialogue applications for clients, such as PayPal and Verizon. And Mary's earliest design experiences were at Bay Area startups. Before design, Mary taught English as a second language at the university level to international students. On the side, she studied physical theater, movement, voice, and acting, and from time to time performed before audiences in solo and ensemble pieces. And we have Brooke Hawkins. Brooke is a senior conversation designer and tech ethicist working for My Planet in Toronto, Canada. She has experience designing chat and voice experiences for a variety of companies, from healthcare organizations to Fortune 500 companies, and has spoken at several voice industry conferences like the IA Summit, Project Voice, and Voice Summit. So, thank you all again for joining us, attendees and panelists. And as you just heard, all of our panelists came from a very wide variety of backgrounds and studied different things in undergrad. And there's really no defined path right now to being a part of conversation design in some capacity. So with that being said, right now in this field, it's so new and it's growing so quickly that anybody can bring their relevant experience. And as long as you're passionate about it, you can become really successful. We wanted to share this. So my passion and my experience with blank has set me up to become a successful conversation designer. So I'm going to put this in the chat. If you would like to tweet it or take a screenshot of this image and tweet that, put it on LinkedIn, something like that. Or you can just put your answer in the chat too, and we can all check out the different backgrounds and experiences that our attendees have come to this session with. And without further ado, we will start on the very first question, which is, to you, what does the craft of conversational consist of? For example, in graphic design, you need to be fluent in grid, layout, type, Gestalt principles, etc. Are there parallel fundamentals to be fluent in within conversational design? If so, what are they? And everybody expressed interest in answering this question, so Rebecca, would you like to start us off?
Framework that I sort of talk about, like what are the pillars of conversation design. And when I work with clients, I like to stress that conversation design is a type of user experience design. So that larger user experience design framework that people use, I know design thinking is a debated topic, but the idea of design being an iterative process that starts with concepting and moves all the way through post-launch iteration. You take that UX framework, and conversation design is a particular focus of that. So there are a few pieces that are unique to conversation design. And to me, they're all very tightly braided together. So to me, the pillars are the prompts that you write, the flows, like the conversational pathways that those prompts result in, and the interaction model or the grammar, like what the user's saying and how that's organized. So those are, to my view, the three pieces that create the user experience. So I would say that conversation designers need to be able to produce those artifacts and understand how they all fit together and how they impact the user's experience. Interested to hear what the other panelists think, so I'll turn it over to someone else.
Sure. Mary, you want to go next?
There's several ways of looking at it. One is like, what are the elements of the experience? So the elements would be the sound, but like if we're dealing with voice user interfaces, not text-based interfaces, the sound of it is really important. And also contextual things, what the person is doing, where their attention is. So there's a kind of cognitive dissonance, cognitive attention that needs to be taken into account, because sometimes on some tasks, people don't need to have their attention on the user interface. So understanding what the mind is doing while a person is interacting with the UI is really important. So there's the experiential level like that. And then I think, though, in terms of fundamentals, for me, what they are is complexity. So understanding the complexity of the language that people use when they want to interact with a system, and understanding the needs of a speech community and how that community talks or communicates. So complexity and structure is really important. Also variation, understanding the variety of language that people use and not imposing our own language variety. So I think it's really important to understand how other communities speak and respect that. Another pillar for me, variety also involves pronunciation and prosody and things like that. So getting the variation right. Also, I like to call it relevance. So making sure that the variation that happens, so how an experience goes through time, we want to make sure that the variation is relevant. So basically having contextual understanding and contextual respect. And I think that comes from the designer. So there's technical things that can give this, but I think designers have to carry that understanding of context of use into the design. And then identity. Actually, I think at the heart of all of this is identity. So understanding the identity of the character that we're creating so that it fits the interaction and the task. And then also understanding the identity of the primary people that we're designing for, and for other groups that we're designing for. So to me, those are the four fundamentals. And then there's all these elements that tie into them, but it would be complexity, variation, relevance, and identity. Yeah.
Thanks, Mary. Brooke, you want to jump on next?
Sure. Everyone's done a great job of answering this question, so I'll keep my answer brief so we can move on to the other ones. But yeah, I think ultimately the principles of conversation design will look really familiar if you already have a background in UX and design within different verticals of design. A lot of that same framework of researching and designing and testing and measurement all look really similar. I think the hardest parts when I was starting my career in conversation design were just, first of all, understanding the existing nomenclature and language around conversation. So things like learning what a grammar is, and learning what an intent is, and learning what a variation of that intent might be. All of that kind of stuff was the primary thing that took a while to learn when I started my career. And then I think from like an organizational perspective, I think when people typically ask this question, I think the underlying question that they're trying to get at is, how do I create a process for designing conversation, perhaps at my organization or something like that? And I just want to assuage everyone to say that I think a lot of organizations are still kind of figuring out these processes even today. So I think the best way to kind of get immersed in these steps, as Rebecca and Mary have talked about, are to just start designing and to start kind of getting comfortable with the language and the processes of conversation design. You'll see naturally how they kind of fit into that typical UX design mindset.
Thank you, Brooke. And Celine?
Can you hear me?
You're good.
Perfect. Yeah, I was saying I don't want to add too much to it as well. I think everyone did a really great point in talking a little bit about main fundamental things that you need to really think about when starting to design for conversations. But the way that I took this question was also a little bit in thinking about some of like the theoretical foundations. And so when I first started reading up on this, I came across the Maxims of Conversation by Paul Herbert Grice, and I thought this was a really great way to kind of introduce people to, okay, like these are some of the things that these conversational principles came out of. And so he talks a lot about like the maximum of quantity, right? So making sure we're talking about information that's actually necessary and not going too above and beyond that. Maximum of quality, so making sure that we're really thinking about the trust with our users and making sure we don't lose that trust by being transparent, by telling things that are true and things like that. The next one is maximum of relevance. So making sure that we actually say things that are relevant to what the conversation is. And I think this one is pretty difficult for us to do just because of the way that the place that technology is in today. And then lastly, the maximum of manner. So making sure we're not being ambiguous or being brief, we're orderly, and things like that.
Great, thank you, Celine. Our next question is, what did you study in undergrad? What degrees would best prepare you for a career in conversational design? What was your last career before entering this field? And what was your first job in conversational user interface design? So, Mary, would you like to start us off with question number 2?
In undergrad, and loved it. I think to prepare for a career in conversation design, there's just so many different aspects of the design that need specialists. So there's more than one path, I think, for sure. Linguistics, sound design. Linguistics is a very large field, so you need people who understand phonology. You need people who understand sociolinguistics, things like that. So there's different paths into it from linguistics. And that was my master's, was in linguistics. So I can only talk about my perspective on it. But I do think I hear that cognitive psychology is really good. And also, of course, studying design is really important. Before I entered design, I was an English as a second language teacher. And I would say that teaching is also a really good field to prepare for design. And also, if you teach writing and rhetoric, those are really good careers and things to study to prepare for conversational design, because writing is a form of design, I think, and teaching is also a form of design. And I can't see the last question. What was it?
What was your first job in conversational user?
Yeah, it was at a startup called Vocal Point, and I got the gig by originally I was hired to do transcriptions from phonetic transcriptions for dictionaries, but transitioned pretty quickly into design. And yeah, that was my first job. We had a voice browser and a multimodal browser, and it was really cool. It was a great startup.
Celine, would you like to talk about this next?
Actually, like a very different approach or path to get where I am today. I studied, like Brielle mentioned, I studied economics and international affairs. So I kind of had like a research background, but really I was very interested in writing. I loved reading and writing. I loved catching up on current events and things like that. And so originally I had considered a career in law, but as I was working for law offices doing legal translating work and paralegal work, I decided quickly that it wasn't for me. And so I started to think about different ways that I could utilize my creative skills, just because I've always been a creative person. I really liked creative writing and things like that. So when I came across UX and conversational design, I was like, wow, like this is something I can actually write and I can design and I can do both across many different modalities. So that's like really cool to just kind of have, and it fit pretty perfectly to what I wanted. So I guess, yeah, like again, Brielle mentioned, there's so many different professions that you can bring into UX and you can utilize them in different ways, right? So let's say like you come from a graphic design background and maybe you focus on visual design, or maybe you don't. But I definitely know that there are ways to get around these obstacles. And my last career, yeah, so I did paralegal, legal assistant, and legal translating work. And my first job was basically I was thrown into a project where we redesigned an entire phone system. And I had no idea what conversational design was at the time. I had no idea what voice design was. So I think I spent like 3 to 6 months really diving into what it was, what the process was, what does the craft look like, what are the fundamentals I need to be thinking about. And it was a long process, and I think I'm still learning every day to day, but it got me to where I am today.
My background is really funny. I have an undergrad degree in chemistry and I have an MFA in fiction writing. So I would say if you're passionate about this field and you're a curious person who really loves language, you can probably find a pathway in. I got into this field. This is also a funny story and true. I got into this field because I sat next to the founder of a startup on an airplane. And we just started talking about crossword puzzles, and he said, oh, I'm doing this startup and we're really looking for someone who's a writer, but has kind of like an analytical brain because we're doing something kind of new with like conversational training games for healthcare. And that's how I got into the field. I worked at that company, Shadow Health, for 5 years. And it was a good time to get into this field because, of course, now it's a job that's a lot more visible and there's a lot of demand for it. I think my last career before that, I was just like working at a restaurant. So I would say if you're interested in this field, you can definitely find a way in.
Awesome. And then what, if you want to keep going on this one, what do you consider a must to create good foundations in this field?
Yeah. Super eager to hear what other people have to say. I think I've thought about this a lot recently because I've been teaching a conversation design course this semester. So when I think about like, what is the one most important thing that I learned the most from in my 8 years in this field? I mean, there's tons of stuff I could say, but the one thing that taught me the most is looking at transcripts from users. So actually looking at conversations that users are having with what you built. It never goes the way you think. You see all kinds of variation you didn't think about. You learn so much about how people express themselves and how they try to correct if the conversation doesn't go well. So I would say that looking at real user data and specifically transcripts is an incredible teaching tool that is really important.
Absolutely agree. Does anyone want to jump in on this one?
Sorry, yeah. I'll say
Okay.
just joining things like this is really good. I found for my career, really just making connections in the field and continuing to go to conferences and network and always be open to interviewing and asking people questions in the field has been really important in my career, especially because this industry is just so new. I hope everyone knows that we're all learning collectively all at the same time. So even though there are experts in the field, there's a lot of learning to always be done. I found that really important.
100%. And also to just agree with the transcript part. And I would add to the transcripts is just listening, just being able to listen to people, even if it's not in the UI, listening to people talking and getting recordings of that and transcribing is a really good technique also.
Our next question is a good one. How does one transition from student to paid jobs? I can see this sort of being talked about in the chat right now. Are there opportunities for freelancing? And how can I describe my skill set and qualifications as a recent grad so I can make myself a more competitive candidate for conversational design roles? And I would like to add to that, how can I describe myself on like my LinkedIn profile, my bio, like what kind of names for these roles are hiring managers using, are recruiters using, are designers themselves using? So Brooke, would you like to start us off with this one?
Yeah, that's. I was just trying to type in the chat as a response to some of the questions I'm seeing, and I think this will answer it. So yeah, I think for those of you in the chat that are talking about taking the Career Foundry course, that's great. I helped to co-author that course, so I'm familiar with the projects that you've done. I think the most important thing after kind of going through a program or school is just being able to speak to your experiences. So even if you don't feel like an expert, just employers want to see how you think through problems. I think that's the most important way to determine if you'd be a successful conversation designer at a company. So just getting familiar and practice with describing how you identify conversational problems, what you did to try to solve for them, maybe how you tested them, maybe if you didn't get time to do all the tests that you want to do, maybe additional questions you have or things that you would like to do if you had more time. I think just showcasing that conversational mindset that you have and making yourself available in terms of showing how you think through problems is the most important way to get a job. And talking to people, like I said, going to conferences, message people, ask them if they'll share a bit of their experience or job experience with you. I found that really important personally as well.
I totally agree with you. And I would also love to add that one thing that really took me off guard in this field when getting into it is how, as a student, you spend your whole entire life seeing other academics gain their authority by spending a lot of time researching something or becoming an expert. And usually in academia, that is associated with an amount of time that you spend doing something. And in a field like this, where it's been around for a while, but in its current paradigm and its current state, things are changing every single day. And with the advent of voice assistants, everything has been there's a brand new field essentially centered around those. So right now the experts are people that A, have the passion to do it, and B, are willing to put in work to get good at it, and then will, put themselves out there on Twitter and Medium and write about it. Because if you are doing the work and you have like enough motivation to get good at it, then people will start to listen to you. Because again, like Rebecca said earlier as well, we are all learning together, and that has really never been truer than right now in this field. So yeah, Rebecca, would you like to take it over from there?
Sort of what I usually advise people. I think that there's so much material out there for self-teaching. And if you're good at self-teaching, just read everything you can get your hands on. Follow Kathy Pearl on Twitter, follow Women in Voice on Twitter. Those, when I was sort of a siloed GUI designer, those were the places where I got a lot of like foundational resources and information. I think the courses are great. I think the most important thing is like, I really firmly believe that conversation design, you have to experience it to learn it. So reading about it is going to teach you concepts, it's going to teach you vocabulary, but until you're actually designing and doing user testing, and going through those cycles of iterating on a product, you're not going to have what employers are looking for. And I think Brooke said it so perfectly. Employers are looking at how you solve problems in these conversational spaces, in these interfaces. So definitely like doing your own hands-on projects is really important. And if you're just getting started, I would try to find a startup and see if they are looking for someone who can wear a lot of hats, who's willing to learn and wants to get into a project that way. So trying to find small companies, like a small company is how I started. And it seems to be a little bit more of a, startups are usually pretty open to enthusiastic beginners. Those are my thoughts on it.
Great point, Rebecca. And for anybody who is wondering how to create a user experience portfolio, like online, Botmock will also be coming out in the next few weeks with sort of a collection of different voice designers and what their portfolios look like, and kind of tips and tricks for how to put your own work up online. So Celine, do you want to take over on this question?
Yeah, so definitely for me, it would be adaptability, just making sure that we're okay with change and we can embrace change and be comfortable with it, and not be afraid, like the other panelists mentioned, being proactive, not being afraid to say, I don't know this, I'm going to figure out who knows it and then talk to people about it. The biggest way that I got in, actually, we ended up hiring a third-party conversational designer, and they took us through the entire process. So like Rebecca mentioned, to actually go through the process from start to finish helped me tremendously to really see like what it took and what the steps were. But I didn't actually stop there, right? I took that advice and I took the process. I learned as much as I could, soaked it all up, and then I said, okay, how does the process fit for me and for my product and my project and my users? And so I started to, from there, adapt the process or start changing the process to fit my needs and my project's needs.
Job descriptions. So I know that my first job was actually, I applied for a voice user interface design guru position. And I had never done it. I didn't even know what a user interface was. So I think it's just really important to take a look at the descriptions. It may not just be called conversation design. Take a look at it and see if there's just, do you match a third of it and go after it. Networking is really important. Just going out and meeting people, going to conferences, all the things that everybody has said, 100% I agree. And I just think it's just important to be brave and to not give up. One-on-ones are great. Doing informational interviews is really useful. All of those things are good. And joining groups that support new designers, I think is great. IXDA is a great organization. I'd recommend that.
I love your point about just being persistent, especially because in this field, I mean, I've seen, like, I kid you not, I've seen 40, 50, 60 different ways to express conversation designer by designers themselves, by hiring managers, by within job descriptions. So it's tricky right now because we're taught to kind of hack the resume game or the job application game by matching keywords in certain job descriptions and trying to sort of set yourself up to be findable. But it's nearly impossible at this point because we're all using different ways to describe these skill sets. So it's really a matter of digging really hard and finding people versus maybe jobs or organizations, because the people are the ones that are most likely to sort of self-identify as being a part of this field. And as everybody's mentioned so far as well, it's still very open, and you can really learn a lot from everybody right now. Okay, and has everybody answered this one? I believe we have, right?
Yeah.
Or, okay, awesome. So moving on to this question. Why is this industry evolving? How is it not a one and done field? If one company makes a chatbot, can't everyone else just copy it with some tweaks? Anyone want to start us off with this one?
Okay, so I have a lot of opinions on this. As someone who's like worked, I know that it's really hard to see how these interactions aren't templatable. Because you think, okay, like whether you're ordering a suitcase, whether you're ordering shoes, whether you're ordering food, surely those all have very similar like conversational structures. And while of course, there are patterns we can derive from human conversations in general, once you get into this field, you start to realize the impact of all those things that Mary was talking about in the beginning, the user's context, their headspace, what they're doing at the time, what the product is, what the content of the language is. All of those things create an incredible amount of variance in how people respond and what their expectations are for the interaction. So I have made, I think, 4 different chatbots for insurance companies, like car insurance companies. And all of those chatbots were different for different business purposes, for different brand voice, and for different user profiles. So even something like a chatbot that lets you check, when your insurance premium is due, all of those are pretty different experiences because we were really responding to specific users and contexts and products. So that's my take on it. Very happy to hear from maybe Mary wants to go, and then Brooke.
I think part of it is that, well, I'm going to just take what I totally agree with what Rebecca just said. And I just want to say, for me, I'm going to take one spin on it because there's just so many different ways to answer this. And that's just that chatbots and voice interfaces are all about, well, they're not all about, but they're, think of it as a probabilistic input problem that you're trying to get people to be using their personal language to interact. And you want them to be able to do it without, so that they can focus on the task and not worry about the language that they're using for their input. So to me, it's just a way of trying to figure out how to get their input. And the thing is, the community that you're designing for, it really has an impact on, it really has an impact on what decisions you're going to be making, design decisions, not only in like whatever behavior the chatbot or voice bot does, but also what it says or how it says it. So there's multiple layers of design that have to be considered. So I do think there are patterns that can be leveraged and better practices, but we're still learning a lot. And also language changes over time. Mm-hmm. So these systems constantly need updating because humans change, and even humans dealing with one interface, their language will change over time. It's just it's the nature of language. So it's never done. And that's probably another question, but I just don't think you can just copy what another place does. And also branding makes a big difference. Brand matters. So a brand needs a different approach. So there's just a lot that goes into it.
Excellent points, Mary.
Totally. Yeah, I love what I'm saying, and so I'll try to say something a little different too. I think users in general and us as consumers, all of our fluency and familiarity with voice experiences is changing constantly. Like, I think about my career designing IVR calls at the beginning of being a voice designer, and during that time, different Alexa devices, different Google devices, different voice devices in general in the car have launched and didn't exist even when I started doing voice design. So not only are the patterns and things like that evolving, and they make different sense depending on the company or the users you're designing for, but like the world we live in is changing, and what your users come to expect from voice is changing, and that's happening all the time.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add retail company background, like the needs of the business change as well, along with the user needs, the use cases for the users using the systems. And like Mary mentioned, yeah, the language is always changing. So what could have worked even like 6 months ago maybe doesn't apply anymore.
Also, like to add from my own experience, when I started as a conversational UX designer, my boss has been in this field for like 25 years. So he worked a lot on IVR systems. I saw somebody mention that in the chat too. And when I joined, he really said, I love that you're passionate about this space. And I also really like that you don't have a ton of experience in this. And I'm not even going to share a lot of the best practices that I have learned over the years, because as somebody mentioned in the chat, why would we, so many people are really anti like IVR because they're basically like a speak to click model, and they're not necessarily they don't really employ a lot of the design principles that we use nowadays. So he said, I don't want to contaminate you with everything I have learned and everything I know. I just want you to start fresh, and we're going to use all the resources that are coming out now and build our own. And that really made me realize like how true it is that we're all learning together, when somebody, and like a true expert in the space would say something like that to me. All right, so does anybody have any final thoughts on this question? I know that this one really fired us up. At least it fired me up. All good? Was someone trying to get on? Okay.
Yeah, so my final thought is I totally agree. Like, it is so important in this field to stay open and be open and understand how much, as the technology improves, constraints that we once had to design for will be lifted. And in the future, there may even be like entirely new ways of organizing. Like right now, we all work off of intents and utterances. In the future, there might be like a totally different system that doesn't use those pieces at all. But I see a lot of people who are new to this field, like sort of learning about voice tech and going like, oh, this technology is new and we've never seen anything like it before. And it's like, no, this has like been coming around since like the 50s. Like people have been doing this stuff for a while. And we do know a lot about, like I see a lot of the tech industry be like, well, how are we supposed to know how humans talk to each other? There's no way of knowing. And it's like, no. But there's linguistics, though. That's a thing, and it's a science. So I do think it's super important to lean on what the humanities and the social sciences and behavioral science all bring to this space, and also super important to know that there are people in our field who have been doing this for 20, 30 years. And we need to continue to look to them because it's not as new necessarily as we think.
Great points, Rebecca. All right, we are going to move on to question 6. How frequently are companies using insights from interactional sociolinguistics or conversational style to design personality for their bots and virtual agents? And I think I saw a question earlier in the chat about how much, how much thought in general does a company, and how many resources, or how much of their resources would they dedicate to sort of defining their personality? I know it can vary from company to company, but Mary, would you like to start this one off?
Yes, something that it's mind the end users. So it's really just important to come up with some really simple ways to promote the perception of the personality in the mind of the end users. Language is one of the elements of that. I mean, there's so many different places where we're encountering these language-based interfaces. There's the chatbot, and then there's the voice. I call them voice bots, for lack of a better term. So you've got voice bots and you've got chatbots, and it's interesting because language itself, if you think about the personality, how do you, I mean, I think people, when they say personality, it's just identity is what we're talking about, and needing to have a consistent identity. We definitely have to make a decision about the language base that the character has. So I think it's just really important to do that, to have a language base. And I don't like the notion of using, quote, standard dialects or standard language. I think that's old-fashioned. I think we can be more open to other dialects that these characters can convey, use language. But the thing is, like, the dialect actually, like, you could have one character, if you go to the psychological side, you could have a character that has a trait, a personality trait. Let's say sophisticated. That's the one I like to do because people don't use that one that often. But let's say you want the character to be perceived as sophisticated. Then you definitely want to try to figure out how to have a vocabulary that supports that notion, and a style of talking. So in terms of how frequently companies are using insights from these things, I don't think they're doing it enough. I think all of us, and even people with backgrounds in linguistics, tend to use their own dialect and their own base community, let's say their own community of practice, as the basis of the language that goes into the bot. So I would say that it's not being done enough, and that's what I would like to advocate for. There's also another interesting problem, and that's the use of machine learning to create output, so for natural language generation. And if you have natural language generation, which tends to introduce more variation, it becomes harder to control the voice of the character so that it has something that's consistent. So I would say they're not using it enough, and the opportunities are huge. Like the need is huge to use sociolinguistics and conversational stylistics.
Actually reminded me of something I heard on a recent podcast with Kane from VUX World, which is a great podcast. Anybody in the chat who's looking for ones to get started with. But Deborah Harrison was the guest, and she was the original writer for Cortana, which is Microsoft's assistant chat and voice. And she mentioned that they really struggled early on with figuring out what kind of vocabulary this bot should have. At first they said maybe, like, because this entity is like a keeper of knowledge and she kind of has like the entire internet at her hands or her disposal, she could like throw in random cool, like, big pieces of, like, big words basically to make her seem like this all-knowing kind of friendly entity. And they decided against that eventually because they didn't want it to come off as like this sort of overeducated and potentially like talking down to its users. So so they made a design decision to not do that. And it again speaks to the question of like, why is this not a one and done sort of situation? It really
yeah, and I think it's a good idea to figure out I really appreciate her perspective on it. I think it's really important to figure out what's colloquial, what's really colloquial. So I always use it's a trick is to really focus on using Anglo-Saxon roots and trying to avoid other types of roots like from Greek or Latin. That really helps to give it a conversational or colloquial flavor. But that's just a trick. But I love Cortana. It's one of my favorite in terms of consistency. Cortana is great.
Wow, interesting. That's a cool trick, Mary. Oh, there you go, Celine.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to add something. So I definitely think kind of like similar to the way that UX has evolved and the need for us to really think about our users has evolved. This is kind of in the baby stages of that, right? For companies to say like, we know that users want this friendly or some type of personality with their bots and virtual agents, but they're quite not there, like Mary had mentioned. And I know for us, one huge thing that we did was we created a persona before we even started to even think about our bot, right? We got this from maybe marketing or research that we had done prior to say, like, what are users looking for? And one thing we found was our users wanted a bot that was very knowledgeable, right? And this is like really cool because this is kind of similar to Deborah. She talks a lot about ethics as well in voice and conversational design. And I wanted to bring this up because one of the biggest questions we had was, were we going to use a male voice or a female voice? And we knew that the personality that users wanted was someone who was knowledgeable. But how are we going to figure out which one is going to portray a better sense of that? And I think the assumption at first was female, always female, right? Like a female has in the past been proven to show they're more of an assistant person and things like that. But because like we were looking for someone that was knowledgeable and the nature of our company, our research actually pointed to a male voice. And just in terms of ethics and thinking about like females and males and like in the past more assistants were females and how that's changing and the way that that's affecting the way that people feel about voice or personalities in their bots is pretty interesting.
We still need to hear from Brooke.
Yeah, I was just typing this in the chat, and I wanted to bring up that Rebecca gave a good talk about bias and the personality of agents at Project Voice. Was it recently, Rebecca, where you presented that? I was trying to share it out as a resource, so maybe after this talk you can give a link to your slides. But yeah, I think just to speak to what everyone else is saying, I think yeah, there's always more that we can do. I find that the best way to test seeing some of these questions come through about bias and conversational style and some of that persona stuff is with testing. And I think someone else had mentioned this earlier, but looking at chat transcripts, listening to live interactions with your bot quickly shows a lot of that bias at play or just those kind of like stopping points that people have with the conversational style that you're using. So I definitely find that kind of testing really important. And I think a lot of like principles from user experience design are really important here when you're researching and trying to determine what your users need. So putting some of that work in ahead of time to really determine those user needs and user expectations rather than just defaulting to a female or a woman sounding bot for the sake of ease. It can do a lot to solve some of these problems too.
Thanks, Brooke. And Rebecca, you want to mention that talk you did and maybe close out this question?
Well, I if people should DM me, like find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm easy to find, Rebecca Evanhoe, and I can share those resources because I don't have them like publicly posted somewhere, although I should. To put a bow on persona, I really think, and Mary said that companies are engaging very much with like testing the persona and thinking really deeply about its impact on the user. There's all kinds of studies that show that people perceive persona really strongly and very instinctively. So it's a huge component of the user's experience. I see a lot of companies thinking of persona as like, oh, we want someone quirky, and we're gonna, the backstory of our chatbot is that she has, a PhD in Native American studies, and she grows orchids, and she grew up in Sacramento, and they come up with these weird backstories that don't really have anything to do with like how a chatbot is supposed to connect with a user and serve and help a user. So when I talk about persona, I always think about like, what are the benchmarks of the interaction? Like, does it need to be efficient? Does it need to be nurturing? Does it need to support a level of intimacy because private information is being shared? Like, what does the interaction need to accomplish? And then I think what persona, what personality traits support something like efficiency or support something like creating a sense of trust. So I think there's a lot deeper ways that us on this call think of persona, and I think we're going to see that continue to deepen as companies kind of reckon with the impact of it.
And I've seen a few questions in the chat about ways to show one's work as a conversational UX designer. So if you follow Botmock on Twitter, LinkedIn, we're actually writing an article right now about ways to do that and showcasing a few conversation designers' portfolios. And then I think we have time for one more question. We can go ahead and, I already did that. Okay, I think question number 8, there were a few mentions of this in the chat, and I saw somebody also ask, how can I, like, in an interview, what sorts of skills can I showcase to make myself a competitive candidate? So as everybody closes us out, I'm gonna put the first slide back on. If you want to screenshot it and put it onto Twitter. I hope that this session sort of drove the point home that if you are passionate and like willing to put in the work to become a conversation designer, that you can do it. The industry is ripe for that right now, and we hope you'll join us in the future for AMAs. I just want to let the panelists close out. That's why I'm doing this housekeeping stuff right now. But yeah, so Brooke, would you like to close us out with how do you see the qualifications needed to become a conversation designer changing within the next couple of years?
Yeah, definitely. With the work that I'm doing now at My Planet, I think we're seeing a lot of multimodal experiences coming down the pipeline, and that's going to be an important skill set for conversation designers, not only to be fluent in the principles of conversation design, but also to be able to work kind of seamlessly with visual designers and developers and think through interface design and gestural design and touch interfaces and things like that. So kind of merging conversation with all of these different disciplines and creating more immersive experiences, I think, is definitely on our horizon. And maybe personally, I definitely think ethics always is just a really important skill to have, or at least having some kind of like fluency, thinking about some of these structural issues that are coming up as we're creating interfaces that are smarter. They have more capacity to measure things about their users. So data tracking, we're personalizing things so intimately, and we're in these intimate settings in people's homes, with them in the car, with them at work. So at least having some kind of perspective and concern around those ethical conundrums that are new and unprecedented and coming up as a designer, I think will be really important.
Celine, do you want to go next? And also the attendees are wondering if you have Twitter. Do you have a Twitter?
I do.
Okay.
It's
I'll
yeah.
take it in.
I'll share it.
Okay, cool.
I'll share it with everyone. But yeah, so I think for me, just being able to think outside the box, right? So not everything has been thought out yet. So when we encounter a problem without a solution to be found, we have to experiment and try to bring solutions from outside of conversational design. And that's where creativity come into play. And that's where I've found to be one of like my biggest skills in learning how to do, because I found it to be really helpful in the way that I design, and then testing those out in a quick way. Yeah.
Design just are always going to stay the same in a way, and good design practice. I think the technology is changing really quickly under our feet. So it's kind of an unknown in a way, but just trying to stay up on the technology and understanding the technological constraints. I think
I want to keep talking with Celine and Brooke and Mary for like another 2 hours. So what I think is changing about the skill set, or evolving about the skill set and about the way people are understanding this field, is when I first came in, everyone was talking about best practices. And a lot of companies, when I was a consultant, came to me and said, just give us a couple workshops on best practices. And I think the field is growing and changing to sort of be like, okay, best practices are kind of not a thing when you're actually considering context, right? So like the skills that designers need are sort of understanding, okay, just general principles. I agree with Mary that certain design foundational principles don't change. But as a designer, it's really important to understand how the impact of your design decisions. So you need to be able to debate the pros and cons of every decision you make and figure out, what data you have on hand to actually support that decision. So it's never an issue of like, best practices say this, we'll do this every time. It's like, okay, there's 2 ways to handle it. This is usually the recommended one, but in our case, we're working with these other constraints, or we have data that shows us this other pathway or this other way to solve something. So the skill set is really looking at your constraints and looking at your data and using that to make really good decisions that serve the user.
And that wraps us up. So we are, which is awesome for how much we managed to pack in today. Thank you to everybody for joining. We're really looking forward to the next ones. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions, and for joining into the chat. But yeah, thank you all for joining.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much for joining. And I was going to add that there's definitely no one way to get into the field, and there's not really a traditional way. So definitely don't be afraid to reach out and ask me any questions that you have.
Thanks, Celine.
Bye.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Brio. Bye.
Thanks, Brooke. Thank you,
Thank you
Rebecca.
so
Thank
much.
you, Mary.
That was great. That was fun.
Thanks for joining, Mary.
Yeah, thank you.